It was a calm afternoon on a packed transatlantic flight. Passengers were settling in, some scrolling through their phones, others flipping through magazines or napping under their blankets. Among them was Dr. Maya Carter, a renowned black physician in her mid-30s, with an air of quiet confidence and a warm, approachable demeanor. She wasn't one for attention, her life was dedicated to helping others, and she wore that purpose with pride. Sitting near the aisle, Maya pulled out her notebook, jotting down thoughts for an upcoming medical seminar she was scheduled to lead. Little did she know, the flight was about to take a dramatic turn that would challenge her resolve and redefine the perceptions of everyone on board. The hum of the engines was interrupted by a sudden announcement over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we have a passenger in medical distress. If there's a doctor on board, please press your call button immediately." Gasps rippled through the cabin, and the passengers exchanged worried glances. Maya's instincts kicked in instantly. Without hesitation, she stood up, her calm yet commanding presence immediately drawing attention. However, as she stepped forward, another passenger in first class, a middle-aged man in a crisp suit with a commanding, if not arrogant, presence, cut her off sharply. "Wait just a second," the man barked, his tone dripping with disdain. "Are you even qualified?" His skeptical gaze swept over her, pausing pointedly at her skin color. Whispers spread like wildfire among the passengers, and tension filled the air. The man, later identified as Arthur Klein, the CEO of a multi-billion-dollar corporation, didn't bother to hide his condescension. "We need a real doctor, not someone playing dress-up." For a moment, Maya was stunned. She wasn't new to prejudice, she'd faced her share of biases in her career, but being called out so publicly in such a dire situation was a first. Yet, she stood her ground, her eyes locked on Arthur with quiet strength. Before she could respond, the flight attendant intervened, glancing between Maya and Arthur, clearly uncomfortable. "Sir," she began hesitantly, "this passenger has identified herself as a doctor. We don't have time to waste." But Arthur was relentless. "And how do we know she's not lying? You're telling me there's not a single other doctor on this entire plane?" His voice grew louder, attracting even more attention. People around them shifted uncomfortably, some looking down at their laps, others stealing glances at Maya as if weighing their own judgments. The seconds stretched, every moment a silent verdict on her credibility. Maya inhaled deeply, steadying herself. She wasn't about to let Arthur's ignorance or prejudice define the situation. But instead of firing back, she calmly reached for her ID badge and medical credentials, which she always carried for situations like this. Handing them to the flight attendant, she said firmly, "If someone's life is on the line, we don't have time for egos." The flight attendant nodded, visibly relieved, and motioned for Maya to follow her. Yet, as Maya began walking toward the passenger in need, Arthur sneered, "If anything happens, that's on you." His words hung in the air, sharp and cutting, as if daring her to fail. Maya paused briefly but didn't turn around. Instead, she squared her shoulders and continued forward. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as passengers debated what they had just witnessed. Some were visibly appalled by Arthur's behavior, while others seemed uncertain, their prejudices perhaps aligning with his. What happened next would leave everyone utterly speechless, shaking the very foundation of assumptions and stereotypes they carried. As Maya followed the flight attendant down the narrow aisle, she could feel the weight of every eye on her. Some passengers watched in curiosity, others in silent support, and a few with skepticism. Arthur's words still echoed in her mind, but she pushed them aside, focusing on the task at hand. A life was at stake, and she wasn't about to let ignorance stand in her way. She reached the row where the distressed passenger sat, slumped in their seat, clutching their chest. The man's face was pale, his breathing shallow and labored. His panicked wife was holding his hand, her voice trembling as she whispered, "Please help him." Maya knelt beside him, her training taking over. She quickly introduced herself, her voice calm but assertive. "I'm Dr. Maya Carter. I'm here to help." She began assessing his condition, asking questions about his medical history, symptoms, and any medications he was taking. The man's wife stammered out responses, her fear evident. The situation was critical, but Maya remained steady, projecting the confidence and competence she had honed over years of working in high-pressure environments. As Maya worked, the whispers from the other passengers grew louder. Some were debating her qualifications, influenced by Arthur's earlier remarks. Others were questioning why anyone would dare to doubt her in such a moment. Meanwhile, Arthur sat smugly in his first-class seat, occasionally glancing back with a look of disbelief, as though waiting for her to falter. His arrogance was palpable, his assumptions etched in every dismissive expression he made. Maya ignored the noise, focusing solely on the patient. She quickly identified signs of a possible heart attack and knew they needed to act fast. Turning to the flight attendant, she instructed, "We need the medical kit and an oxygen tank now." Her tone left no room for hesitation, and the attendant rushed off to retrieve the supplies. Maya continued talking to the man, her soothing voice steadying both him and his frantic wife. "I'm here. You're going to be okay. Just keep breathing slowly." The flight attendant returned with the emergency kit, and Maya worked swiftly, applying an oxygen mask to the man's face and administering a medication to stabilize his condition. She knew time was of the essence and that the plane might need to make an emergency landing. Glancing up, she addressed the flight attendant again. "Please inform the captain of the situation. We may need to divert to the nearest airport." As the flight attendant relayed the message, Arthur couldn't resist chiming in, his voice carrying over the murmurs of the cabin. "Are we seriously taking her word for it? We don't even know if she's really a doctor." His tone was mocking, his words laced with a toxic blend of doubt and arrogance. A few passengers looked at him in shock, while others seemed unsure, their own biases perhaps clouding their judgment. Maya didn't respond, refusing to let Arthur's provocations distract her. Instead, she focused entirely on the man before her, monitoring his vitals and ensuring he remained stable. But inside, a fire burned. She wasn't just fighting to save a life, she was also fighting against the prejudice that Arthur represented, a prejudice that sought to diminish her, to question her abilities, and to reduce her worth to a stereotype. As minutes ticked by, the tension in the cabin grew thicker. Passengers whispered among themselves, the drama unfolding before them like a live theater production. Many were quietly rooting for Maya, their earlier skepticism giving way to admiration as they saw her skill and dedication. A few even began to speak up, challenging Arthur's remarks. "Why don't you let her do her job?" one man said sharply, glaring at Arthur. "She's clearly the only one stepping up here." Arthur, however, was undeterred. "This isn't about me," he retorted, raising his hands in mock innocence. "I'm just saying, we should be careful who we trust. Lives are at stake, after all." His words dripped with insincerity, his smirk making it clear that he wasn't concerned about the patient at all. His real agenda was rooted in his ego, a need to assert his perceived superiority, even in a moment that demanded humility and humanity. Maya kept her head down, working tirelessly to stabilize the man. Yet, Arthur's words weren't lost on her. They were a reminder of the battles she had fought throughout her life, the double standards, the constant need to prove herself, and the moments when her competence was questioned simply because of her appearance. But this wasn't about her, she reminded herself. It was about the man whose life hung in the balance, and she wasn't going to let him down. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing that the plane was being diverted to the nearest airport. Relief washed over the cabin, though the tension lingered, amplified by the unresolved conflict between Maya and Arthur. The passengers had seen enough to know who the real hero was, but Arthur's presence remained a thorn in the narrative, his arrogance a stark contrast to Maya's quiet determination. As the plane began its descent, the atmosphere grew quieter, the hum of the engines the only sound as passengers processed what they had witnessed. Maya continued to monitor the patient, her focus unwavering. The man's wife clung to her hand, tears streaming down her face as she whispered, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Maya offered her a small, reassuring smile, but her mind was already racing, thinking ahead to the next steps once they landed. Arthur, meanwhile, leaned back in his seat, his arms crossed and his expression sour. His attempts to undermine Maya had clearly backfired, but his pride wouldn't let him admit it. Instead, he muttered under his breath, his words too faint to be heard but his disdain still evident. As the plane touched down and the paramedics boarded to take over, Maya finally stepped back, allowing herself a moment to breathe. The passengers erupted into applause, a spontaneous outpouring of gratitude and respect for the woman who had defied doubt and prejudice to save a life. But even as the applause echoed through the cabin, Arthur sat silently, his face a mask of bitterness. Maya returned to her seat, her heart still racing but her mind at ease. She had done what needed to be done, and that was enough. But as she glanced around the cabin, she couldn't help but wonder how many others had silently shared Arthur's doubts, how many had questioned her abilities without ever voicing it. The thought was sobering, a reminder of the work that still needed to be done, not just in saving lives, but in challenging the biases that held people back. And just when it seemed the drama had come to an end, Arthur stood up, his voice cutting through the cabin once more. "I still think this was reckless," he declared, his tone defiant. "Someone needs to be held accountable if anything goes wrong." The room fell silent, the applause fading as quickly as it had begun. All eyes turned to Maya, waiting to see how she would respond. She looked up at Arthur, her gaze steady and unflinching. The next words she spoke would determine the course of everything that followed. The air in the cabin felt charged as all eyes remained on Arthur and Maya. His brazen declaration had pierced through the applause, leaving a palpable tension hanging between them. Maya didn't flinch. She simply looked at Arthur, her calm demeanor a stark contrast to his belligerence. For a moment, it felt as though the entire plane held its breath, waiting for her response. "I don't need your validation," Maya finally said, her voice firm but measured. "I did what was necessary to save a life. If you want to hold someone accountable, start with yourself, for wasting precious time when it mattered most." Her words landed heavily, resonating with the passengers who exchanged knowing glances. Arthur opened his mouth to respond but hesitated, perhaps realizing he no longer held the upper hand. His ego, however, refused to let him remain silent. "You're deflecting," Arthur said, his tone colder now. "You think being a doctor makes you immune to scrutiny? I'm just asking questions that anyone would in my position." His words carried the thinly veiled implication that he thought his position, his wealth, his power, gave him the right to pass judgment on everyone else. Before Maya could respond, another passenger spoke up. It was an older woman with silver hair and an air of authority. "I've been sitting here, listening to your nonsense for far too long," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "You're not asking questions out of concern. You're asking because you think you're better than her. Well, newsflash, Mr. CEO, she's the only reason that man is alive right now. What exactly have you done today to make the world better?" A ripple of agreement swept through the cabin, and a few passengers nodded, their earlier silence giving way to open support for Maya. Arthur glared at the woman, but she met his stare without blinking. "You don't know me," he retorted, his voice lower now but still defiant. "And you don't know her. For all we know, she got lucky." This time, the murmurs of disapproval were louder, and Arthur shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The flight attendants glanced at each other nervously, clearly unsure of how to handle the growing tension. Maya remained silent, choosing not to dignify Arthur's words with a response. She had spent her entire career proving herself in a world that often underestimated her. She wasn't about to waste energy on someone so determined to misunderstand her. As the plane taxied to the gate, Maya's mind wandered briefly to the patient now being transferred to the care of paramedics. She hoped her quick action had given him the best chance for recovery. Yet, even in the aftermath of saving a life, Arthur's words lingered. It wasn't just about him, it was about what he represented. She had encountered his type before, men and women who saw her skin color or gender as obstacles to her capability, who questioned her worth before they even knew her name. As the passengers began gathering their belongings to disembark, a flight attendant approached Maya with a grateful smile. "Thank you for what you did today," she said softly. "You made a real difference." Maya nodded, appreciating the sentiment, but her eyes flicked briefly to Arthur, who was now on his phone, speaking in a hushed but agitated tone. He was clearly not done, and Maya braced herself for whatever might come next. The conflict took an unexpected turn at the gate. As passengers waited in line to exit, 2 airport security officers boarded the plane. The flight attendants had informed the airline of the incident, and the officers were there to ask questions. Arthur, seeing an opportunity, immediately stepped forward. "I'd like to report a concern," he said, his voice smooth but calculated. "This so-called doctor claimed to be helping a passenger, but I think it's important to verify her credentials. For everyone's safety, of course." The officers looked puzzled, their eyes shifting to Maya, who remained composed. "Is there an issue?" one of them asked. Maya calmly handed over her identification and medical license, which the officer examined before returning with an apologetic nod. "Everything checks out. Dr. Carter, thank you for your assistance today." Arthur, undeterred, pressed on. "How can you be sure? People can forge documents. I'm just saying, this needs a thorough investigation. We can't just take her word for it." At this point, another voice chimed in. It was the man Maya had saved, now seated in a wheelchair as paramedics prepared to move him. His voice was weak but steady. "She's the reason I'm still breathing. I don't care what this man says, she's a hero." His words silenced the room, leaving Arthur momentarily speechless. The passengers who had been watching erupted into applause again, this time louder and more unified. Arthur's face flushed, and for the first time, he looked genuinely uncomfortable. The officers, sensing this situation didn't warrant further escalation, turned to Maya. "Dr. Carter, you're free to go." Thank you again for your quick thinking and professionalism." Maya nodded, her gaze briefly meeting Arthur's as she stepped off the plane. She didn't say a word, but her silence spoke volumes. As she walked through the terminal, Maya couldn't help but reflect on the events of the flight. The adrenaline was wearing off, replaced by a mix of exhaustion and frustration. It wasn't just about Arthur, it was about a world that still allowed people like him to hold so much power over how others were perceived. But even in the face of such blatant prejudice, Maya found solace in the gratitude of the passengers who had stood by her, and in the knowledge that she had done the right thing. Outside the terminal, Maya was greeted by a journalist who had caught wind of the story. Word of her heroics had spread quickly, and people were eager to hear her side. But Maya hesitated, unsure if she wanted to turn this deeply personal experience into a public spectacle. Yet, as she thought about the countless others who face similar challenges every day, she realized the importance of speaking out, not for herself, but for those who might not have the strength or platform to do so. As she prepared to share her story, she knew the battle wasn't over. Arthur Klein might have been silenced for now, but he was just one piece of a much larger puzzle. The real fight was against the systems and attitudes that allowed people like him to thrive unchecked. Maya took a deep breath, her resolve stronger than ever. This was about more than just one flight or one man's ignorance. It was about challenging a world that still had so much growing to do. And she was ready to be a part of that change. Maya's decision to speak with the journalist set off a chain reaction she hadn't anticipated. The story of the flight, the emergency, and Arthur Klein's public humiliation began spreading rapidly across social media. Clips recorded by passengers had surfaced, showing Maya's calm and collected demeanor as she saved a man's life, contrasted sharply with Arthur's condescending and inflammatory comments. The internet, as it often does, quickly divided into camps, those hailing Maya as a hero and those questioning why this incident had become a public spectacle at all. But overwhelmingly, the support for Maya drowned out the noise. Arthur, however, was far from ready to let the matter rest. The CEO of one of the most influential corporations in the country, he was unused to being questioned or facing public backlash. As the story gained traction, his company began to feel the heat. Employees leaked internal memos, exposing a toxic workplace culture under Arthur's leadership. Investors began asking questions, and prominent figures on social media started calling for accountability. Arthur, desperate to control the narrative, arranged a press conference to address the incident. Maya, meanwhile, tried to go about her life as usual, but the unexpected spotlight made that nearly impossible. Her hospital colleagues were overwhelmingly supportive, though some quietly cautioned her about the risks of taking on someone as powerful as Arthur. Her family, always her rock, encouraged her to stand firm. Yet, the stress of being thrust into the center of such a public controversy weighed heavily on her. She couldn't help but wonder how things might have played out if she had stayed silent, if she had simply let Arthur's words roll off her back like she'd done so many times before. The press conference was Arthur's chance to regain control, and he made sure it was a grand spectacle. Dressed impeccably in a tailored suit, he stood at a podium in front of a room packed with reporters. "Let me start by saying that I regret the misunderstanding that occurred on that flight," he began, his voice carefully modulated. "I deeply respect the medical profession and the work Dr. Carter did to assist a fellow passenger. However, my concerns were never about her ability, but rather the protocols surrounding medical emergencies on commercial flights. It was a calculated move, designed to sound apologetic while subtly shifting blame away from himself." Maya watched the conference from her apartment, shaking her head at the thinly veiled attempt to rewrite the narrative. It was a reminder of why so many people in her position stayed silent, because speaking out often meant enduring this kind of gaslighting and deflection. But if Arthur thought his carefully worded statements would put the matter to rest, he was mistaken. Social media erupted almost instantly, with hashtags like #WeStandWithMaya trending worldwide. The turning point came when a high-profile figure, a celebrity known for championing social justice causes, publicly called out Arthur during a live interview. "This isn't just about a doctor being disrespected on a plane," they said. "This is about systemic racism, sexism, and the abuse of power. And it's about time people like Arthur Klein were held accountable." Their words ignited a firestorm, putting even more pressure on Arthur and his company. Arthur's frustration turned to desperation. Behind the scenes, he attempted to discredit Maya, hiring private investigators to dig into her past. It was a move straight out of a corporate playbook, designed to intimidate and silence her. But Maya had nothing to hide, and when news of the investigation leaked, it only made Arthur look worse. The public saw it for what it was, a smear campaign against a woman who had done nothing wrong. As the tension reached its peak, Maya received an unexpected call. It was from a former employee of Arthur's company, someone who had suffered under his leadership and wanted to expose the truth. They claimed to have evidence, emails, recordings, and internal documents, that could not only vindicate Maya but also bring to light the full extent of Arthur's misconduct. The whistleblower was hesitant, afraid of retaliation, but they believed Maya's story had created an opportunity to finally bring Arthur down. Maya felt a mix of emotions, hope, anxiety, and a renewed sense of purpose. The whistleblower's evidence could change everything, but it also raised the stakes. If Arthur was already willing to go to such lengths to protect his reputation, what might he do if he felt truly cornered? The risk was enormous, but so was the potential for change. The next day, Maya met the whistleblower in a quiet cafe, their conversation hushed and intense. They handed her a flash drive, explaining its contents in detail. "This is bigger than just you or me," they said. "This is about everyone he's hurt, everyone who's been too scared to speak up. If you're willing to take this on, I'll stand with you. But you need to be prepared, he's not going to go down without a fight." Maya felt the weight of the responsibility settling on her shoulders. She knew she couldn't back down now, not when so many people were counting on her. As she left the cafe, clutching the flash drive tightly, she couldn't shake the feeling that this was the moment everything had been building toward. The battle lines were drawn, and the climax of this story was just around the corner. Maya returned home with the flash drive, her mind racing with possibilities and concerns. She plugged it into her laptop, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the files. What she saw made her heart pound. The whistleblower had been telling the truth, the evidence was damning. There were emails showing Arthur's blatant disregard for ethical practices, recordings of him making disparaging remarks about employees, and documentation of financial mismanagement that could not only ruin his reputation but also lead to serious legal consequences. This was bigger than she had imagined, and the weight of what she now possessed felt almost suffocating. But as Maya sifted through the files, something else caught her eye, an email exchange from just 2 days before the flight incident. It was between Arthur and a senior executive at his company, discussing an upcoming merger. The deal was shrouded in secrecy, but the emails hinted at something illegal, insider trading. Arthur had been using his position to manipulate stock prices, lining his pockets while leaving employees and stakeholders in the dark. This revelation added a new layer of complexity to the conflict. It wasn't just about Arthur's public behavior, it was about systemic corruption on a scale Maya hadn't anticipated. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself. Maya called the journalist she had spoken with earlier, arranging a meeting to share the new information. The journalist, initially skeptical, was stunned when Maya laid out the evidence. "This isn't just a story anymore," the journalist said, their voice laced with urgency. "This is a scandal that could bring down an empire." They promised to begin investigating immediately, but they also warned Maya that things were about to get much more dangerous. Arthur wouldn't take this lying down. True to form, Arthur was already plotting his next move. He had caught wind of the whistleblower's involvement and was growing increasingly paranoid. In a desperate attempt to regain control, he decided to escalate his efforts to silence Maya. Using his extensive network, he reached out to a high-powered legal team to file a defamation lawsuit against her, claiming she was spreading falsehoods to tarnish his reputation. The lawsuit was designed to intimidate her, to drain her resources, and to send a clear message to anyone else who might think of standing against him. The lawsuit wasn't Arthur's only tactic. Behind the scenes, he enlisted a private PR firm to launch a counter-narrative. Articles began appearing online, painting Arthur as a misunderstood leader and casting doubt on Maya's credibility. Anonymous sources questioned her motivations, suggesting she was seeking fame or a financial settlement. It was a calculated strategy, and while many saw through it, the seeds of doubt began to take root in some corners of the internet. Maya felt the pressure mounting. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from reporters, supporters, and critics alike. She couldn't open social media without seeing her name trending, often alongside hateful comments and baseless accusations. Yet, even in the face of this onslaught, she refused to back down. She had come too far to let fear dictate her actions. One evening, as she sat in her apartment trying to formulate her next steps, she received an unexpected call. It was the whistleblower. Their voice was shaky, filled with a mix of fear and urgency. "I think they're onto me," they said. "I've been followed the past few days, and strange things have been happening, emails disappearing, my car being tampered with. You need to be careful, Maya. They're playing dirty." The call left Maya shaken but resolute. If Arthur and his allies were willing to resort to such tactics, it only confirmed the importance of exposing the truth. But the stakes were now higher than ever. She wasn't just fighting for justice, she was fighting to protect herself and the whistleblower from whatever lengths Arthur might go to maintain his power. The tension reached a boiling point when Maya's hospital received a formal complaint, alleging that she had violated patient confidentiality by discussing the in-flight incident publicly. It was a thinly veiled attempt to discredit her professionally, and while her colleagues rallied to her defense, the investigation put her job on the line. Arthur's reach seemed limitless, and for the first time, Maya wondered if she had underestimated the depth of his influence. As the walls closed in, Maya found an unlikely ally. One of Arthur's former business partners, a man who had distanced himself from Arthur years ago, reached out after seeing the media coverage. He revealed that Arthur had wronged him in the past and that he had been waiting for the right moment to expose Arthur's true character. He offered to testify, providing additional evidence to bolster Maya's case. It was a glimmer of hope in an otherwise bleak situation, but it also added another layer of complexity. If they were going to bring Arthur down, they needed to move carefully and strategically. Maya and her allies began working tirelessly, piecing together a plan to release the evidence in a way that would be undeniable and unassailable. They coordinated with the journalist, who was preparing an explosive exposé, and reached out to legal experts who could help navigate the defamation lawsuit. But as the clock ticked down to the planned publication of the story, Maya couldn't shake the feeling that Arthur still had something up his sleeve. That feeling was confirmed when she received an anonymous email late one night. The subject line read, "Stop now, or else." The message contained no text, just a single attachment, a grainy photo of her parents' house. It was a chilling reminder of what she was up against, and it left Maya more determined than ever. Arthur might have power, money, and connections, but she had the truth, and she wasn't going to let him intimidate her into silence. The tension reached its breaking point as the journalist's exposé was set to go live. Every detail had been carefully fact-checked, and the whistleblower's documents had been cross-referenced with Maya's account and additional testimonies. The article was explosive, laying bare not only Arthur's behavior during the flight but also his history of misconduct and the deeper corruption within his company. Included were the insider trading allegations, supported by the damning emails Maya had uncovered. The release was timed perfectly, coinciding with a major shareholders' meeting, ensuring the story couldn't be buried. When the article went live, it was like a bombshell detonating in the corporate world. Within hours, news outlets picked up the story, and it dominated headlines. Arthur's PR team scrambled to control the narrative, but the evidence was too overwhelming. Social media erupted with calls for his resignation, and even some of his staunchest supporters began to distance themselves. Investors started pulling out, and regulatory authorities announced an investigation into the insider trading claims. Arthur's world was crumbling, but he wasn't done fighting. The same evening, he held a press conference, trying to deny the allegations. "This is a coordinated attack on my character," he declared, his voice trembling with barely concealed anger. "The so-called evidence is fabricated, and I will not be bullied by baseless accusations." But his bravado didn't last long. As he spoke, one of the journalists in the crowd stood up and played an audio recording, a clip from the files Maya had provided. It was unmistakably Arthur, discussing the insider trading scheme in chilling detail. His face went pale as the room erupted into chaos. Meanwhile, Maya watched the events unfold from her apartment. For the first time in weeks, she felt a glimmer of relief. The truth was out, and it was only a matter of time before Arthur faced the consequences. But just as she allowed herself to exhale, her phone buzzed with a notification. It was an encrypted email from an unknown sender. The subject line read, "You missed something." The email contained a single video file. Maya hesitated for a moment before pressing play. The footage showed Arthur in a private meeting with an unfamiliar man. They were discussing the insider trading scheme, but the stranger seemed to be the one orchestrating everything. With Arthur merely following orders. "I'll handle the fallout," the man said confidently. "You just keep your mouth shut and stick to the plan." It was a revelation that sent chills down Maya's spine. Arthur wasn't the mastermind, he was a pawn in something much bigger. Maya forwarded the video to the journalist, who immediately began investigating. Within hours, they identified the man in the video as a powerful hedge fund manager with deep ties to political figures and major corporations. The journalist called Maya, their voice filled with urgency. "This changes everything. Arthur was bad, but this guy? He's the one pulling the strings. Exposing him could take down an entire network of corruption." But the revelation also raised new risks. The hedge fund manager had resources far beyond anything Arthur could muster, and going after him would be dangerous. Maya felt the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She had already risked so much, but could she stop now, knowing there was more to uncover? In the end, Maya decided she couldn't let fear win. She and the journalist worked together to release the new information, this time coordinating with legal authorities who had begun investigating the case. The fallout was swift and far-reaching. The hedge fund manager's empire unraveled, and Arthur, left without his powerful ally, faced criminal charges that ensured he wouldn't escape accountability. But the twist didn't end there. In the weeks that followed, Maya received an unexpected visitor. It was the whistleblower, their face drawn with a mix of relief and lingering fear. "There's one more thing you need to know," they said quietly, handing her a sealed envelope. Inside were documents revealing a secret fund set up by Arthur's company, money siphoned off over the years to bribe officials and silence critics. It was the final piece of the puzzle, ensuring that no loose ends remained. Maya handed the documents over to the authorities, knowing this would finally close the chapter on Arthur and the web of corruption he was entangled in. As the dust settled, she found herself reflecting on the journey. It had been grueling and terrifying, but it had also proven something she had always believed: the truth, no matter how deeply buried, would always find its way to the surface. And while the battle had left scars, it had also brought her a renewed sense of purpose. The story ended with Arthur and his accomplices facing justice, and Maya returning to her life as a doctor, more determined than ever to use her voice for good. She had been thrust into a fight she never asked for, but she emerged stronger, a reminder to everyone watching that even in the face of overwhelming odds, courage and integrity could make all the difference. As the dust finally began to settle, Maya found herself reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey had been harrowing, filled with moments of doubt and fear, but also moments of incredible strength and clarity. Arthur's downfall wasn't just about exposing one man's greed and prejudice, it was a catalyst that shed light on the larger systems of corruption and abuse that had gone unchecked for far too long. The ripple effects of the revelations were impossible to ignore. The company Arthur once helmed was now under strict oversight, with new leadership vowing to rebuild its reputation through transparency and accountability. Employees who had long felt silenced finally had a platform to speak out, and their courage sparked further investigations into unethical practices within other organizations. For Maya, returning to her normal life was a strange adjustment. Her work as a doctor had always been her passion, but now it felt even more significant. The experience reminded her of the power of standing up for what was right, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. Patients who had heard about her story would often thank her, not just for her medical care but for inspiring them with her courage. Each kind word reminded her that the fight hadn't been in vain. The journalists who had worked so closely with Maya continued their investigative reporting, diving deeper into systemic issues that had been exposed through Arthur's case. Their work led to a series of articles that tackled inequality, corporate corruption, and the resilience of individuals like Maya who refused to back down. They often credited Maya in interviews, calling her a hero not just for what she had endured on that flight, but for how she had turned her pain into action that sparked meaningful change. Arthur, meanwhile, was facing the full weight of the law. The charges against him were severe, and his attempt to frame himself as a victim fell flat. In the courtroom, Maya testified about the events of that fateful flight, her voice steady and unwavering. It was a surreal experience to face him again, but this time, she wasn't alone. The support she felt from those around her, the passengers who had stood by her, the journalist, the whistleblower, gave her strength. Arthur's conviction was a pivotal moment, not just for her, but for everyone who had been wronged by him. Justice had been served, and the message was clear: no one, no matter how powerful, was above accountability. But what struck Maya the most was the unexpected community that had formed around her. People from all walks of life reached out, sharing their own stories of discrimination and resilience. Some had faced similar situations of prejudice and had felt powerless, but Maya's story gave them hope. She realized that while she hadn't sought the spotlight, her experience could be a source of empowerment for others. Slowly, she began to use her voice beyond the hospital walls, speaking at events and advocating for equality in professional spaces. Her speeches weren't just about her own experience but about the broader need for compassion, understanding, and justice. The whistleblower also found a new chapter of their own. After years of working in the shadows, their courage in coming forward inspired other employees in similar situations to follow suit. They became a quiet but steadfast advocate for corporate accountability, working with organizations dedicated to protecting whistleblowers and ensuring safer environments for those who dared to speak up. As for the airline, It launched an initiative to ensure all employees, from ground staff to executives, underwent diversity and sensitivity training. They implemented policies aimed at preventing incidents of discrimination, making it clear that such behavior would not be tolerated. Maya's name became a symbol of change, a reminder that one person's bravery could lead to a better, fairer system. Despite all the public attention, Maya remained grounded. Her life wasn't perfect, and the scars from her ordeal didn't fade overnight. But she found peace in the small, everyday victories: healing a patient, mentoring a young medical student, or even just spending time with her family. These moments reminded her of why she had fought so hard, and they kept her moving forward. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Maya received a letter. It was from a young girl who had seen her story on the news. The girl wrote about how she had always dreamed of becoming a doctor but had doubted herself because of the discrimination she'd faced in school. "Because of you, I know I can do it," the letter read. Maya felt tears well up in her eyes. It was a simple message, but it carried so much weight. It was a reminder that her fight hadn't just been for herself, it was for everyone who needed to believe that they were capable of achieving their dreams, no matter the obstacles. The world didn't change overnight. Prejudice and corruption still existed, and there were still battles to be fought. But Maya's story showed that even in the face of injustice, one voice could spark a movement. Her journey was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of standing up, not just for yourself but for others. And as she looked ahead, Maya knew that while her role in this chapter had come to an end, the story of change and hope would continue, carried forward by those she had inspired. It was a busy afternoon at Ridgeway General Hospital, the kind of day where the air felt thick with urgency. Nurses bustled in and out of patient rooms, doctors flipped through charts with practiced efficiency, and the faint hum of medical equipment formed an ever-present backdrop. Among the chaos, Nurse Mia Bennett moved with quiet confidence. Her scrubs were perfectly pressed, her posture straight, and her presence calm and professional, even amidst the whirlwind of activity. Mia was used to being overlooked in the hospital's hierarchy. As a black nurse in a facility where she was one of the few, she had grown accustomed to the occasional dismissive tone or sidelong glance. But her dedication to her patients never wavered. She had a warmth that made even the most nervous patients relax, her ability to listen often doing as much good as the medicine she administered. On this particular day, she was assigned to room 214, a private suite reserved for high-profile patients. The hospital had been abuzz with whispers about the man occupying the room, a patient who had checked in under an alias but was clearly someone of importance. The details were scarce, but the word executive had been murmured enough times to raise curiosity. Mia had barely stepped into the room when Dr. Greg Foster entered behind her. A senior physician with years of experience, Dr. Foster had a reputation for his sharp medical skills and his equally sharp tongue. He was brilliant, no doubt, but his bedside manner often left much to be desired. Mia had worked with him enough times to know he had little patience for anyone he deemed beneath him, nurses, interns, and sometimes even the patients themselves. "Did you even check his vitals properly, Nurse Bennett?" Dr. Foster barked as he walked in, not bothering with a greeting. His tone was loud, curt, and dismissive, a verbal slap in front of the man lying in the hospital bed. Mia's cheeks flushed, but she kept her composure. "Yes, doctor," she replied evenly, handing over the clipboard. "His vitals are stable, but he mentioned feeling lightheaded earlier." "I thought it was worth noting," Dr. Foster cut her off with a wave of his hand. "I'll decide what's worth noting, thank you," he snapped, barely glancing at the chart. "Next time, try not to waste my time with irrelevant details." The patient in the bed, an older man with a sharp gaze and a calm demeanor, watched the exchange without a word. He had a presence about him, something that hinted at authority, even in his hospital gown. Though his face betrayed no emotion, his eyes flicked between Mia and Dr. Foster with quiet intensity. Mia's grip tightened around the clipboard, but she refused to let Dr. Foster's words rattle her. She'd learned long ago that standing her ground with grace often spoke louder than a heated retort. Instead, she focused on the patient, offering him a kind smile. "Mr. Smith," she said, using the name on the chart, "if there's anything else you need, just press the call button, and I'll be here right away." Dr. Foster scoffed. "If he needs anything, he'll get it from someone more competent," he muttered under his breath, but loud enough for both Mia and the patient to hear. Mia swallowed the lump rising in her throat, her professionalism keeping her rooted. She nodded to the patient and left the room quietly, her footsteps measured and steady despite the storm brewing inside her. Once she was gone, the room fell into a thick silence. Dr. Foster began flipping through the chart, still muttering about incompetent staff and wasting his time. The patient watched him for a moment longer, then spoke, his voice steady and deliberate. "Tell me, doctor," he began, his tone as calm as it was piercing, "do you always speak to your staff that way?" Dr. Foster froze, the chart lowering just slightly. He glanced at the man, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. But the doctor's pride was a stubborn thing, and he quickly masked it with his usual arrogance. "I speak to them as they deserve," he replied dismissively, turning back to the chart. "Now, let's focus on your condition, shall we?" The patient's lips curled into a faint smile, one that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Oh, we'll focus on that soon enough," he said, his voice laced with an undertone that made Dr. Foster pause. "But first, let me tell you a little bit about myself." Dr. Foster finally looked up, the chart forgotten in his hands. For the first time in years, he found himself caught off guard, his confidence wavering under the weight of the patient's steady gaze. What followed next would leave him questioning everything he thought he knew about respect, humility, and the true cost of arrogance. Mia made her way down the brightly lit corridor, her steps quick and deliberate. She didn't let the sting of Dr. Foster's words show, but deep down, she could feel the familiar ache creeping in. It wasn't the first time someone like him had belittled her, and she doubted it would be the last. Her hands gripped the edges of the clipboard tighter, knuckles whitening. She reminded herself of why she chose this profession, to help people, to make a difference, and not to prove her worth to people who refused to see it. She stopped at the nurse's station, setting the clipboard down with a soft thud. Lisa, one of her colleagues, glanced up from the monitor she was typing on. "You okay?" Lisa asked, her brow furrowing slightly as she noticed the tension in Mia's jaw. Mia forced a small smile, brushing it off. "Yeah, just another round with Dr. Foster." Lisa rolled her eyes knowingly. "That man's ego is bigger than this hospital. Don't let him get to you." "I won't," Mia replied, though the tightness in her chest told a different story. Meanwhile, back in room 214, the tension between the patient and Drive Foster thickened. The doctor stood by the window, pretending to focus on the man's test results, but he couldn't shake the unsettling feeling creeping up his spine. "So," the patient said casually, breaking the silence. "Is that how you treat all your staff? Or just the ones you think can't push back?" Dr. Foster turned, his expression hardening. "I treat my staff how they deserve," he repeated firmly. "This is a high-pressure environment, Mr. Smith. If someone can't handle constructive criticism, they shouldn't be here." The patient chuckled softly, the sound more amused than warm. "Constructive? That's what you call it?" He leaned back against the pillows, his eyes sharp and calculating. "You must be very good at justifying your actions, doctor. I wonder how often that's worked for you." Dr. Foster stiffened, his pride flaring. "I'm here to ensure the best care for my patients, not to discuss my management style." "Interesting," the man mused, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Because from what I just witnessed, you seem more interested in tearing down the people who help you. Tell me, doctor, where would you be without your nurses?" Dr. Foster's lips pressed into a thin line, his temper barely contained. "With all due respect, Mr. Smith, I don't think this conversation is relevant to your treatment." "Oh, I think it's very relevant," the man said, his tone hardening slightly. "Especially when you realize who I am." Dr. Foster faltered, his confidence visibly cracking. He studied the patient, searching for a clue, anything that might reveal why this man was so self-assured, why his words carried an edge that cut deeper than the usual complaints he brushed off. But before he could speak, the man continued. "You checked me in under an alias," he said, his voice low but commanding. "A smart move, considering my position. But let me make one thing clear, you have no idea who you're dealing with, Dr. Foster." Dr. Foster's throat tightened, the weight of the man's words sinking in. "Who? Who are you?" he asked, his voice quieter now, tinged with uncertainty. The patient didn't answer immediately. Instead, he let the silence hang in the air, his gaze never leaving Dr. Foster's. Finally, he leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the room despite his weakened physical state. "Let's just say," he began, his voice cold and deliberate, "the decisions I make can change lives, yours included. So, if I were you, I'd think carefully about how you speak to people. Because today might be the day you learn just how small this world can be." Dr. Foster's face paled as the weight of the man's words pressed down on him. For the first time in his career, he felt a flicker of doubt, not about his medical abilities, but about the way he carried himself, the way he treated those around him. And yet, even as the reality of the situation began to dawn on him, He couldn't shake the nagging voice in his head that insisted he was untouchable. After all, he was Dr. Greg Foster, one of the most respected physicians in the hospital. What could this man, whoever he was, possibly do to him? But as the patient's sharp gaze held his, Dr. Foster couldn't ignore the gnawing feeling that his arrogance had finally led him somewhere he couldn't escape. The hospital hallway outside room 214 buzzed with its usual energy, but Mia found herself pausing at the corner. She leaned briefly against the wall, her eyes fixed on the clipboard in her hands, not really seeing the words on the page. Her thoughts lingered on the man in the bed and the strange undercurrent in the room when she'd left. Something about him, the way he carried himself, the calm yet commanding presence, felt out of place. Patients usually displayed some vulnerability, but this man seemed like someone who rarely, if ever, found himself in a position of weakness. She took a steadying breath and straightened her shoulders. Dwelling on these things wasn't going to make her shift any easier. She had plenty of other patients who needed her care, and there wasn't time to let Dr. Foster's condescension or her own curiosity distract her. But as she walked away, the memory of the man's measured smile lingered, nagging at the back of her mind. Inside the room, Dr. Foster had regained a shred of his composure, though unease still clung to him like a shadow. The man, Mr. Smith, as far as the chart stated, had settled back into his bed, watching the doctor with an expression that seemed equal parts amusement and warning. "I don't have time for games, Mr. Smith," Dr. Foster said, attempting to assert himself again. "If there's something about your condition I need to know, now's the time to tell me. Otherwise, I suggest we focus on your treatment." The patient tilted his head slightly, as if assessing the doctor's words. "Oh, I assure you, my condition is just fine," he said with a faint smile. "But perhaps your focus is better spent elsewhere. Like on how you speak to the people keeping this hospital running." Dr. Foster bristled but chose not to take the bait this time. He scribbled a note on the chart, his pen moving faster than usual, betraying his irritation. "If you're done dispensing life lessons," he said without looking up, "I'll send someone in to take your blood work." The man's smile widened, just enough to unsettle the doctor. "You do that, doctor. I'll be right here, thinking about what comes next." Dr. Foster snapped the chart shut and walked out, his polished shoes clicking against the tiled floor. As the door swung closed behind him, the patient's gaze lingered on it for a moment before he leaned back into the pillows, his expression turning thoughtful. Down the hall, Mia was preparing a cart with supplies for her next patient when Dr. Foster approached, his face tight with frustration. He stopped at the station, giving her a pointed look. "Nurse Bennett," he said sharply, "make sure the lab prioritizes Mr. Smith's tests. I don't want any delays." Mia looked up, startled by his tone, but nodded. "Of course, doctor. I'll take care of it right away. And next time," he added, lowering his voice but keeping the edge, "if you're going to note symptoms, make sure they're relevant. I don't need distractions when I'm dealing with high-profile patients." She bit the inside of her cheek, resisting the urge to respond in kind. Instead, she kept her voice steady. "Understood, doctor." Dr. Foster didn't wait for a reply, striding off toward his office with the same clipped steps. Lisa, who had overheard the exchange, sidled up to Mia as she wheeled the cart away. "What's his problem today?" Lisa asked under her breath. Mia sighed. "Same as always. But Mr. Smith? There's something different about him. Did you hear anything about who he might be?" Lisa shook her head. "Not really, just that admin's been unusually quiet about his stay. That usually means money or influence, or both." "Why? Did he say something?" "Not much," Mia admitted, "but he doesn't act like a typical patient. It's like, I don't know, like he's watching everything. And not just in a curious way." Lisa raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "Maybe he's one of those CEO types. They're always sizing people up, figuring out how to get the upper hand. Could be a corporate big shot recovering from stress or surgery." "Maybe," Mia said, though she wasn't convinced. As the evening progressed, the hospital began to quiet down, the frenetic energy of the day giving way to the hum of machines and the soft murmurs of night staff. Mia's thoughts kept drifting back to room 214. She couldn't explain why, but something about the whole situation felt off. The way Dr. Foster had acted, the tension in the air, the strange confidence of the patient, it all seemed like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite fit together. Later that night, Mia found herself passing by the room again, her steps slowing instinctively. The door was slightly ajar, and she hesitated, torn between curiosity and professionalism. Finally, she tapped lightly and stepped inside. "Mr. Smith?" she asked softly, careful not to disturb him if he was asleep. The man was awake, sitting upright in bed with a tablet in his hands. He looked up as she entered, his expression softening when he saw her. "Nurse Bennett," he said warmly. "Back to check on me?" She smiled politely, stepping closer. "Just making my rounds. I wanted to see how you were feeling." "Better," he said, setting the tablet aside. "Thanks to you, I suspect. You seem like the kind of person who takes their work seriously." "I try," she replied, a hint of unease creeping into her voice. He studied her for a moment, his gaze steady but not unkind. "Tell me, Mia, may I call you Mia?" She nodded hesitantly. "Tell me, Mia," he continued, "do you enjoy working here?" The question caught her off guard. "I do," she said carefully. "It's challenging, but I like helping people." "I can see that," he said, his tone thoughtful. "You have a presence about you. Compassion, intelligence. A rarity in places like this." Mia felt her cheeks warm slightly. "Thank you. That means a lot." He leaned forward slightly, his voice lowering. "Then why do you let people like Dr. Foster treat you the way he does?" Mia froze, the question cutting deeper than she expected. She looked away, trying to find the right words. "I don't let it bother me," she said finally. "He's difficult, but it's not about me. It's about the patients." The man nodded, though his eyes darkened slightly. "Admirable. But let me give you a piece of advice, don't let people like that go unchecked. Sometimes, standing up for yourself isn't just about you. It's about changing the way others see the world." Mia frowned, unsure how to respond. Before she could say anything, the man leaned back against the pillows, his expression softening again. "Thank you for checking on me," he said, the conversation seemingly closed. She nodded, turning to leave, but as she reached the door, his voice stopped her. "Oh, and Mia?" he called, his tone light but carrying an undeniable weight. She turned back, her hand resting on the doorframe. "Remember," he said with a faint smile, "the smallest actions can have the biggest consequences." Mia left the room with a strange sense of unease, her thoughts swirling with questions. Who was this man? And why did it feel like he knew far more about her, and the hospital, than he let on? The air in the hospital seemed heavier the next day, though it was hard to pinpoint why. Mia couldn't shake the lingering unease from her conversation with Mr. Smith, and as she moved through her tasks, she noticed small, subtle changes. Staff whispered in clusters near the nurses' station, their glances darting toward room 214. The usual rhythm of the hospital felt interrupted, as though everyone was waiting for something to happen. Mia avoided the chatter as much as she could. She focused on her patients, pouring her energy into checking vitals, adjusting 4 lines, and offering reassurances to worried families. Still, the tension was inescapable, pressing against her every time she passed the room where Mr. Smith rested. By mid-afternoon, she found herself at the nurses' station again, updating charts. Lisa approached, her voice low but insistent. "Have you heard?" Lisa asked, glancing over her shoulder to make sure no one was listening. "Heard what?" Mia replied, keeping her tone neutral. "About Smith," Lisa said. "Apparently, admin's been fielding calls all day. Someone high up, really high up, is keeping tabs on him." Mia frowned, unsure how to respond. "That's unusual," she said carefully. Lisa nodded, leaning closer. "Unusual doesn't even cover it. I don't know who he is, but whatever he's involved in, it's got the higher-ups spooked. Even Dr. Foster's been quieter than usual. Did you notice? He hasn't barked at anyone all morning." Mia had noticed but hadn't connected it to Mr. Smith. "What do you think he's here for?" she asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted the answer. "No clue," Lisa said, straightening as Dr. Foster himself rounded the corner. The doctor's expression was unreadable, his usual sharpness tempered by something close to caution. He barely acknowledged the nurses as he passed, heading straight for room 214. Lisa and Mia exchanged a look, then returned to their work, though Mia's thoughts were far from focused. Inside the room, Dr. Foster found Mr. Smith seated upright, his tablet in hand once again. The man looked up as the doctor entered, his expression unreadable. "Doctor," Mr. Smith said, his tone polite but cool. "To what do I owe the pleasure?" Dr. Foster hesitated, a rare occurrence for the usually confident physician. "I wanted to check in personally," he said, his voice measured. "Make sure everything is progressing as it should." Mr. Smith raised an eyebrow, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "How considerate of you. Is this standard practice, or am I just lucky?" Foster cleared his throat, choosing to ignore the jab. "Your tests have come back normal so far, but we're running a few additional panels. I want to ensure there's no underlying condition we might have missed." "Of course," Mr. Smith said, setting the tablet aside. "Though I suspect there's more on your mind than my test results." The doctor stiffened, the man's calm demeanor unnerving him. "I'm not sure what you mean." "I think you do," Mr. Smith said, his gaze steady. "You're a man who values control, Dr. Foster. But control is a fragile thing, isn't it?" Foster's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, the door opened, and a hospital administrator stepped in. The tension in the room shifted instantly as the administrator, a middle-aged woman with a professional but strained expression, addressed Mr. Smith directly. "Mr. Smith," she said, her tone carefully neutral. "I wanted to personally ensure your stay has been comfortable. Is there anything you need?" Dr. Foster's eyes widened slightly. It was rare for administrators to involve themselves directly with patients unless there was an extraordinary reason. Mr. Smith's smile returned, warmer this time but still guarded. "Thank you, Ms. Carter. Everything has been satisfactory so far. I appreciate the attention." "Of course," she said quickly, glancing at Dr. Foster as though to gauge his reaction. "If there's anything at all, you require, please don't hesitate to let us know." She excused herself shortly after, leaving Dr. Foster feeling even more unsettled than before. As the day stretched on, Mia couldn't avoid being drawn into the growing mystery. After her shift ended, she found herself lingering in the break room, her thoughts spinning. What kind of man could command such attention? And why did it feel like he was orchestrating something, pulling strings in a way no ordinary patient could? Lisa joined her after a while, her usual humor replaced with a serious expression. "Mia, I don't know about you, but I think this is bigger than we realize," she said, sitting across from her. "What do you mean?" Mia asked, though she had her own suspicions. "Think about it," Lisa said. "All this attention, the weird vibes in admin, even Foster acting like he's on eggshells. Something's happening, and it's connected to that man." Mia nodded slowly. "I just don't understand what he could want. He doesn't seem sick, at least not in the usual way. And the way he talks. It's like he knows more than he's letting on." Lisa leaned closer, her voice dropping. "Do you think he's some kind of undercover investigator? Maybe for the government or something?" Mia hesitated. The thought hadn't occurred to her, but now that Lisa mentioned it, it didn't seem impossible. "Whatever he is," Mia said finally, "it's clear he's here for more than treatment. And I have a feeling we're going to find out sooner rather than later." Neither of them noticed Dr. Foster passing by the break room, his expression dark as he overheard the tail end of their conversation. The doctor's mind was racing, piecing together fragments of interactions and whispers. He didn't like being kept in the dark, and he certainly didn't like the idea of being evaluated by someone he couldn't control. For the first time in years, Dr. Foster felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Doubt. Doubt about his decisions, about his approach, and most troubling of all, about what might come next. The night shift had its own rhythm, quieter but no less intense. Mia found herself once again drawn toward room 214. It wasn't part of her duties tonight, but curiosity gnawed at her, mixed with a strange sense of responsibility. She told herself it was professional concern, a need to ensure her patient was cared for. But deep down, she knew it was more than that. Mr. Smith's presence lingered in her thoughts like a puzzle she couldn't solve. The hallways were dimly lit, the sounds of distant monitors and hushed voices creating an almost eerie ambience. As she approached the room, she noticed the door was slightly ajar, casting a sliver of light onto the tiled floor. Her heart quickened as she stepped closer, unsure of what she might find. Inside, Mr. Smith was not asleep. He was seated on the edge of the bed, fully dressed in a simple but elegant suit, his posture relaxed yet alert. A briefcase rested beside him on the bed, and he was scrolling through his tablet with a focused expression. "Working late, Nurse Bennett?" he said without looking up, his voice cutting through the quiet. Mia froze for a moment, caught off guard by how he always seemed to anticipate her presence. "I was just checking in," she said hesitantly. "You're dressed. Are you leaving?" He set the tablet down and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Not just yet. But soon, I think. My business here is almost concluded." "Business?" she echoed, stepping into the room. "I thought you were here for treatment." A faint smile tugged at his lips. "We all have our reasons for being where we are, don't we? Some are just less obvious than others." Mia felt a shiver run down her spine. There was something in his tone, an undercurrent of meaning she couldn't quite grasp. She crossed her arms, trying to maintain her composure. "If there's something you're not telling us, something about your health, we need to know." "We can't help you if we don't have the full picture. You're a very dedicated nurse," he said, his smile softening slightly. "But don't worry, Mia. I assure you, I'm in excellent hands." The way he said her name made her pause. It wasn't unusual for patients to address her personally, but coming from him, it felt different. Intimate, almost, as though he knew her far better than he should. "Why are you here, Mr. Smith?" she asked, her voice quieter now. "Really?" For a moment, he didn't answer. He stood, picking up the briefcase and placing it on the bed. When he turned back to her, his expression was calm but serious. "Let's just say I'm observing," he said finally. "Taking note of how people behave when they think no one's watching. It's enlightening." Mia's brow furrowed. "Observing what? The staff? The hospital?" "Everything," he replied simply. Before she could press him further, the door swung open, and Dr. Foster entered, his expression tight with frustration. He stopped short when he saw Mia, his eyes narrowing slightly. "What are you doing here, Nurse Bennett?" he demanded. Mia straightened, her professional demeanor snapping into place. "I was checking on Mr. Smith, doctor. I noticed he was awake." Foster's gaze shifted to Mr. Smith, who remained standing by the bed, his calm demeanor in stark contrast to the doctor's irritation. "Is there a problem, doctor?" Mr. Smith asked, his tone polite but with an edge that made Foster hesitate. "No," Foster said quickly, though his clenched jaw suggested otherwise. "But it's late. You should be resting." Mr. Smith chuckled softly. "Rest is a luxury, doctor. And one I'll indulge in soon enough." Foster's irritation deepened, but before he could respond, Mr. Smith reached for his briefcase and opened it. He pulled out a sleek envelope and handed it to the doctor. "What's this?" Foster asked, eyeing it suspiciously. "Consider it an opportunity," Mr. Smith said, his tone light. "One I hope you'll take." Foster hesitated before taking the envelope. He didn't open it, but his grip on it tightened as though he could feel the weight of whatever was inside. "This is highly irregular," he said, his voice tinged with suspicion. "Life often is," Mr. Smith replied, his smile returning. Foster glanced at Mia, his expression unreadable, before turning back to Mr. Smith. "We'll discuss this tomorrow." "Of course," Mr. Smith said smoothly. "Take your time. I'm not going anywhere just yet." Foster left without another word, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. Mia watched him go, her unease growing with every passing moment. When she turned back to Mr. Smith, he was already sitting back on the bed, the briefcase closed and placed neatly at his side. "You have a way of making people uncomfortable," Mia said, unable to keep the words from slipping out. Mr. Smith looked at her, his expression unreadable. "Only those who have something to hide." Mia's breath caught, but before she could respond, he lay back against the pillows, closing his eyes as though signaling the conversation was over. She stood there for a moment longer, her mind racing, before quietly leaving the room. As she walked back to the nurse's station, her thoughts were a whirlwind of questions. What was in the envelope? Who was Mr. Smith, really? And why did she feel like she was standing at the edge of something far bigger than she could comprehend? The next morning, the hospital buzzed with an undercurrent of tension that everyone could feel but no one could explain. Mia arrived early, her mind still tangled with the events of the previous night. As she passed the nurse's station, she overheard snippets of hushed conversations. "Foster's been in meetings all morning," someone said. "Something about that patient in 214. Mia tried to focus on her tasks, but the knot in her stomach tightened with every passing hour. She noticed small, unusual details. Security seemed heavier in the halls near Mr. Smith's room. Administrators moved through the ward more frequently, their faces tight with stress. And though Dr. Foster usually made his rounds by mid-morning, he was nowhere to be seen. Around noon, Lisa caught up with Mia in the break room. Her face was flushed, her usual playful demeanor replaced by a serious urgency. "You won't believe this," Lisa said, lowering her voice to a near whisper. "I just overheard Foster talking to Carter. He's furious. Whatever was in that envelope, it's got him completely shaken." Mia leaned closer, her heart racing. "Did you hear what it was?" Lisa shook her head. "Not exactly, but it sounded like some kind of ultimatum. Foster kept saying he couldn't be expected to make a decision like this overnight. Carter was trying to calm him down, but it didn't sound good." Mia frowned, her unease deepening. Mr. Smith had been cryptic, but she hadn't expected him to have this much power. What kind of decision could leave someone like Dr. Foster so rattled? By mid-afternoon, curiosity got the better of her. Mia decided to check on Mr. Smith herself. She found him sitting in his usual spot, looking impossibly composed. His tablet rested on the table beside him, but he wasn't using it. Instead, he seemed to be staring out the window, lost in thought. "Still observing?" Mia asked, trying to keep her tone light as she stepped into the room. He turned to her, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Always." Dr. Foster seemed upset this morning, she ventured, hoping to coax some kind of explanation out of him. "Did he?" Mr. Smith asked, tilting his head slightly. "Interesting," Mia sighed, feeling frustration bubble to the surface. "Look, I don't know what's going on here, but it's affecting everyone. If there's something you can tell me, something that might help." He raised a hand, cutting her off gently but firmly. "You're a good person, Mia. That much is clear. But sometimes, the best way to help is to simply stay out of the way." She stared at him, stunned into silence by his bluntness. Before she could respond, the door opened, and two men in suits entered the room. They moved with the kind of quiet authority that immediately set Mia on edge. "Mr. Smith," one of them said, his voice calm but firm. "We need to speak with you." "Of course," Mr. Smith replied, his smile never faltering. He glanced at Mia. "Perhaps we can continue our conversation another time." Mia nodded stiffly, her instincts screaming at her to stay but knowing she had no excuse to linger. As she stepped into the hallway, she couldn't help but glance back. The two men closed the door behind them, cutting off her view. The rest of the day felt like an eternity. Every time she passed by Mr. Smith's room, the door remained closed, with no sign of the suited men leaving. Dr. Foster was still avoiding the floor, and even Lisa seemed more subdued than usual. By the time her shift ended, Mia's nerves were frayed. She lingered in the staff locker room, trying to convince herself to go home. But as she changed out of her scrubs, she realized she couldn't leave. Not yet. The hospital was quieter in the evening, the usual bustle of the day shift replaced by a more subdued energy. Mia made her way back to the ward, careful to avoid drawing attention to herself. She paused outside room 214, her heart pounding as she listened at the door. She couldn't hear much, muffled voices, low and intense. Her curiosity got the better of her, and she gently pushed the door open just enough to peer inside. Mr. Smith was still seated on the bed, but his demeanor had shifted. He no longer seemed relaxed or amused. Instead, he looked every bit the powerful figure she had suspected he might be, his expression sharp and commanding. The two men in suits stood on either side of him, their faces unreadable. One of them held a folder, which he handed to Mr. Smith with a small nod. Mia's breath caught as she saw Mr. Smith open the folder and scan its contents. His eyes narrowed slightly, and he closed it with a decisive snap. "Everything is in place," he said, his voice carrying an authority that sent chills down Mia's spine. "We move forward as planned." The men nodded in unison, and one of them glanced toward the door. Mia stepped back quickly, her heart racing as she retreated down the hallway. She didn't stop until she reached the stairwell, her mind spinning with questions. What was in place? What were they planning? And how did it all connect to the strange tension that had gripped the hospital over the past few days? As Mia leaned against the cold concrete wall, trying to catch her breath, she realized one thing with absolute certainty: whatever was happening, it was far bigger than she could have imagined. And somehow, she was caught in the middle of it. Mia stayed in the stairwell for what felt like an eternity, trying to steady her breathing and make sense of what she just witnessed. She replayed the scene in her head, the calm authority in Mr. Smith's voice, the unspoken agreement among the men in suits, the ominous words, "Everything is in place." Her instincts screamed that this wasn't just hospital politics. It was something bigger, something dangerous. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, startling her. She pulled it out and saw a message from Lisa. "Where are you? Foster's asking for you. Something's going on with 214. Mia's stomach churned. She wasn't ready to face Dr. Foster, not when her mind was swimming with unanswered questions. But avoiding him would only raise suspicion. Steeling herself, she made her way to the nurse's station. Lisa was waiting for her, her usual bubbly demeanor replaced by a tight-lipped seriousness. "Foster's in his office," she said quietly. "He doesn't look good. Whatever's going on with Mr. Smith, it's eating him alive." Mia nodded and headed to the office, her palms damp with sweat. She knocked lightly on the door, and Foster's sharp voice called out, "Come in." Inside, the room was dimly lit, the blinds drawn. Dr. Foster sat at his desk, his tie loosened and his face lined with exhaustion. He looked up as she entered, and for the first time since she'd known him, he seemed vulnerable. "Nurse Bennett," he said, gesturing for her to sit. She hesitated but complied, her heart pounding. "I need to ask you something," he began, his voice unusually soft. "Have you noticed anything strange about Mr. Smith?" Mia's throat went dry. She considered lying, brushing off the question with something vague. But the weight of the moment pressed down on her, and she found herself nodding. "I have," she admitted. "He's different. And the way you've been acting around him, it's like you're scared of him." Foster's expression darkened. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. "Scared isn't the right word," he said finally. "Cautious, maybe. Do you know who he is?" Mia shook her head, her pulse quickening. "He's not just a patient," Foster said, his voice barely above a whisper. "He's connected. Powerful. The kind of person who can ruin lives with a phone call. And for some reason, he's chosen to test me." "Test you?" Mia echoed, her confusion growing. Foster opened a drawer and pulled out the envelope Mr. Smith had given him. He slid it across the desk to her. "This," he said, "is what's been keeping me up all night." Mia hesitated before picking up the envelope. She opened it carefully, her hands trembling, and pulled out the contents, a single sheet of paper. Her eyes scanned the page, and her breath caught. It was a contract. At first glance, it looked innocuous, something about hospital policy and patient care protocols. But as she read further, the implications became clear. Mr. Smith wasn't just evaluating his own treatment, he was evaluating the entire hospital, its staff, its leadership. And the consequences of failing his test were staggering. "He's a high-level consultant," Foster explained, his voice tinged with bitterness. "Sent here to decide whether this hospital is worth saving or if it's better off being dismantled. And everything we've done, every decision we've made, has been under his microscope." Mia stared at the paper, her mind racing. "Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked, her voice shaking. "Because he asked me not to," Foster said. "And because I was afraid of what he'd do if I didn't comply." Mia's thoughts spiraled. She thought of the patients, the staff, the countless lives that would be affected if the hospital shut down. And then she thought of Mr. Smith, sitting calmly in his room, pulling strings like a puppet master. "This isn't right," she said, her voice firm. "He shouldn't have this much power over us," Foster sighed, looking more defeated than she'd ever seen him. "Maybe not. But what can we do? He's already made up his mind. All we can do now is wait for the fallout." Mia clenched her fists, a spark of defiance flaring in her chest. "There has to be a way to fight this," she said. "We can't just roll over and let him destroy everything." Foster didn't answer. He just looked at her, his eyes filled with a mixture of resignation and despair. As Mia left the office, her resolve hardened. She didn't know what she was going to do, but she knew one thing for sure, she wasn't going to let Mr. Smith win without a fight. She returned to the ward, her mind racing with possibilities. The hospital felt different now, the familiar halls suddenly tinged with a sense of impending doom. Every interaction, every decision, seemed to carry more weight. And as she passed room 214, she felt his eyes on her, sharp and unyielding, as if he already knew what she was planning. Mia spent the next several hours pacing her small apartment, replaying everything in her mind. Mr. Smith's calm demeanor, Foster's unease, the ominous contract, it all felt like pieces of a puzzle she couldn't quite assemble. She tried to think of someone who could help, someone who might have answers, but every idea led to the same dead end. What did she really know about Mr. Smith? Who could she trust in a situation like this? As the city outside her window buzzed with life, Mia sat down at her kitchen table, opening her laptop. If Mr. Smith was as powerful as Foster implied, there had to be something about him online. She typed his name into the search bar, hesitating for a moment before hitting enter. The results were sparse, which was strange enough on its own. A man with that much influence should have at least some presence, articles, interviews, even a social media footprint. But the pages she found were vague, his name appearing in scattered reports tied to corporate audits or high-profile lawsuits. He was always mentioned briefly, never the focus. Then she saw it, a single headline buried on the third page of search results: "Whistleblower vanishes after exposing corruption at major hospital chain." Her heart skipped a beat. The article was from years ago, detailing a case where a consultant had uncovered massive financial fraud in a hospital group. The consultant, unnamed in the piece, had disappeared shortly after making his findings public. The story had been quietly swept under the rug, no follow-ups, no further details. Mia leaned back in her chair, her thoughts racing. Could Mr. Smith have been involved? Was that why he seemed so untouchable? And if so, what kind of danger had Foster, and by extension, she, stumbled into by questioning him. The next morning, Mia returned to work with a newfound sense of urgency. The hospital felt heavier, the tension in the air almost palpable. Staff whispered in corners, their eyes darting toward room 214 as if expecting something, or someone, to emerge. Mia's every step felt deliberate as she made her way to Lisa, who was busy logging vitals into a chart at the nurse's station. "You're not going to believe this," Mia whispered, pulling Lisa aside. She quickly recounted what she'd found, her voice low but insistent. Lisa's eyes widened, her face a mixture of disbelief and fear. "That's insane," Lisa said. "You think he's here to do the same thing? Blow the whistle on something?" "Maybe," Mia replied. "Or maybe he's here to do something worse." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of raised voices down the hall. Mia turned to see Dr. Foster standing outside Mr. Smith's room, his face flushed with anger. One of the suited men stood in front of him, calm but unyielding, blocking the door. "This is my hospital," Foster said through gritted teeth. "You don't get to dictate how I run it." "Your hospital?" the man replied, his voice cold. "Not for long." Mia felt a chill run down her spine. She glanced at Lisa, who looked just as unsettled. Without thinking, Mia started down the hallway, her curiosity overriding her caution. She stopped just short of the confrontation, close enough to hear but far enough to avoid drawing attention. "You think you're untouchable," Foster continued, his voice shaking with frustration. "But I won't let you ruin everything I've built here." The suited man smirked. "You've already done that yourself, Doctor. We're just here to clean up the mess." Foster's face fell, his anger replaced by a flicker of fear. Before he could respond, the door to room 214 opened, and Mr. Smith stepped out. He looked at Foster, then at the suited man, and for the first time, Mia saw something crack through his calm exterior. Annoyance. "That's enough," Mr. Smith said, his voice firm but quiet. He turned to Foster, his expression unreadable. "Doctor, I suggest you take a moment to collect yourself. You're not helping your case." Foster hesitated, his jaw tightening, but he eventually turned and walked away without another word. The suited man followed Mr. Smith back into the room, shutting the door behind them. Mia stood frozen in place, her mind spinning. What had Mr. Smith meant by your case? And why did it feel like Foster wasn't the only one being judged? As the day wore on, Mia couldn't shake the feeling that something was building, an invisible storm gathering just out of sight. She tried to focus on her work, but every time she passed room 214, her pulse quickened. She wanted to confront Mr. Smith, to demand answers, but a deep, instinctive fear held her back. That evening, as the halls quieted and the staff thinned out, Mia decided she couldn't wait any longer. She made her way to room 214, her footsteps echoing in the empty corridor. She hesitated outside the door, her hand hovering over the handle. Before she could knock, the door opened, and Mr. Smith stood before her, his expression calm but expectant. "Nurse Bennett," he said. "I wondered when you'd come." Mia swallowed hard, her resolve faltering under his steady gaze. "I need to know what's going on," she said, her voice trembling. "Why are you really here? What are you doing to Foster?" Mr. Smith smiled faintly, stepping aside to let her in. "Come in, Mia. I think it's time we had a proper conversation." As she stepped into the room, the door closing softly behind her, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking into something far more dangerous than she'd ever imagined. Mia stepped into the room, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure Mr. Smith could hear it. The air inside felt heavier, as though it carried the weight of secrets too large to comprehend. Mr. Smith gestured toward the small chair by the window, but Mia remained standing, her arms crossed defensively. "I'll stand," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. "Start talking. Why are you here, and what do you really want?" Mr. Smith gave a slight nod, as if appreciating her directness. He leaned back in his chair, his piercing gaze never leaving hers. "You're persistent," he said calmly. "I admire that. It's rare these days." "Stop deflecting," Mia snapped. "You've been playing games with everyone in this hospital. Dr. Foster is barely holding it together, and now you're dragging me into whatever this is. I deserve answers." Mr. Smith's expression didn't change, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, approval, perhaps. He folded his hands in his lap and let out a small sigh. "Very well," he said. "But understand this, the truth is far more complicated than you might expect." Mia didn't respond, her silence urging him to continue. "This hospital," Mr. Smith began, "is on the brink of collapse. Financially, ethically, operationally, you name it. Foster has made mistakes, yes, But the problems run deeper than one man's failings. My role here is to assess whether it's worth salvaging or if it should be dismantled entirely." Mia frowned, her mind racing. "You're talking about shutting down the hospital? What happens to the staff? The patients? This place is a lifeline for so many people." "Precisely why I'm here," he replied. "To determine whether those lives are better served by fixing what's broken, or starting fresh elsewhere." Mia shook her head, anger bubbling to the surface. "You're treating this like it's a spreadsheet, like these are just numbers to crunch. But this is people's lives. Their families, their futures. You can't just—" Her voice trailed off as Mr. Smith raised a hand, not to silence her, but to acknowledge her point. "You're right," he said. "This isn't just about numbers. Which is why I look beyond the spreadsheets, to the people. To see who rises to the occasion and who reveals their true colors under pressure." Mia narrowed her eyes. "And that's why you've been targeting Foster? To push him, to test him?" Mr. Smith leaned forward slightly, his expression unreadable. "Foster is a complicated man. He's made sacrifices, some noble, others selfish. He's hidden things that could destroy this hospital faster than I ever could." Mia's breath caught. "What kind of things?" Mr. Smith didn't answer immediately. Instead, he reached for a folder on the table beside him, sliding it across to her. "See for yourself," he said. Mia hesitated, her hand hovering over the folder. Her gut told her that whatever was inside would change everything, but she wasn't sure she was ready to face it. After a moment, she opened it, her eyes scanning the contents. Inside were documents, financial records, emails, signed contracts. At first, the technical jargon made little sense, but as she pieced it together, a horrifying picture emerged. Misallocated funds, falsified reports, unauthorized surgeries, all connected to Foster. "This can't be real," Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. "He wouldn't." "I assure you, it's very real," Mr. Smith said. "Foster's been covering his tracks for years. But the truth always comes out, one way or another." Mia closed the folder, her hands trembling. She felt like the ground beneath her was crumbling. Dr. Foster had been difficult, even infuriating at times, but she'd always believed he wanted what was best for the hospital. Now, she wasn't so sure. "What are you going to do with this?" she asked, her voice shaking. "That depends," Mr. Smith said. "If Foster can prove he's capable of change, perhaps there's hope for him. But if not—" He let the sentence hang, the implication clear. Mia stared at him, her mind racing. She wanted to hate him, to see him as the villain in all of this. But the more he spoke, the harder that became. He wasn't just here to destroy, he was here to uncover the truth. The problem was, the truth might destroy them all. Before she could respond, there was a knock at the door. One of the suited men entered, his expression grave. "We have a situation," he said, his eyes flicking briefly to Mia before focusing on Mr. Smith. "What kind of situation?" Mr. Smith asked, his tone calm but sharp. "The files," the man said. "They've been leaked." Mia's heart dropped. She looked at Mr. Smith, whose expression remained unreadable. "Leaked? What does that mean?" she asked, her voice rising. "It means," Mr. Smith said, standing slowly, "that someone has decided to escalate this far beyond what I intended. And now, the real game begins." Mia's chest tightened as she watched him move to the door, his calm demeanor unwavering. "Stay close, Nurse Bennett," he said over his shoulder. "Things are about to get very complicated." And with that, he was gone, leaving Mia alone in the room with nothing but the damning folder and a sense that she was in far deeper than she'd ever imagined. Mia's pulse quickened as she rushed out of the room, trailing after Mr. Smith. The hallway was alive with a strange tension, staff whispering in clusters, their gazes darting toward the closed doors of the administrative offices. Whatever had been leaked was already sending shockwaves through the hospital. She caught up to Mr. Smith near the central elevator bank, his composed stride unfaltering. "What do you mean?" "The files were leaked? By who?" she demanded. "I wish I knew," he replied, not breaking his pace. "But whoever did it has just forced my hand, and Foster's." As they stepped into the elevator, Mia's thoughts raced. The documents in the folder had been enough to ruin Foster, perhaps even shut the hospital down. But now that they were out in the open, the consequences would be far-reaching. "Do you think it was Foster?" she asked, her voice low. Mr. Smith shook his head. "He has too much to lose. If he wanted to bury this, he'd keep it contained. No, this came from someone else. Someone who benefits from chaos." The elevator doors opened to the top floor, where the hospital's boardroom was located. As they stepped out, Mia's stomach churned. Through the glass walls, she could see the hospital's board members already assembled, their faces a mix of confusion and anger. Foster stood near the head of the table, pale and visibly shaken. Mr. Smith entered the room without hesitation, his presence commanding instant attention. Mia followed hesitantly, her instinct to retreat warring with her need to see this through. "Ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Smith began, his tone calm but firm, "I'm sure you've all seen the files by now. They raise serious concerns about this hospital's leadership and operations." Foster turned to him, his voice breaking. "This is a setup. I would never." "Enough," Mr. Smith interrupted, his voice sharp. "The evidence speaks for itself, Dr. Foster. But before we pass judgment, let's consider how these files came to light." The room fell silent. Mia felt the weight of every gaze as Mr. Smith turned toward her. "Nurse Bennett," he said, his tone softer now. "You've been at the heart of this from the beginning. Perhaps you can shed some light." Mia froze, her mind racing. Why was he putting her on the spot? She wasn't the one who leaked the files, was she? Then it hit her. The documents. She'd left them in the break room earlier, distracted by Lisa's questions. Could someone have found them there? I don't know who leaked them," she stammered. "But if they did, maybe it's because they thought the truth needed to come out." Foster scoffed. "The truth? You think this hospital can survive the truth? The lawsuits alone will destroy us." "That's not for you to decide," Mr. Smith said, his voice steely. "This isn't about saving your career, Dr. Foster. It's about accountability, and the future of this hospital." The board members murmured among themselves, their expressions ranging from concern to outright disdain. It was clear they were weighing their options, and Foster was losing ground. But before anyone could speak, the doors burst open, and one of the suited men from earlier entered, his face grim. "We have a problem," he said, addressing Mr. Smith. "The leak wasn't limited to the files. Someone's been digging into your background as well." Mia's breath caught. She looked at Mr. Smith, whose calm exterior faltered for the first time. "What are you talking about?" he asked. The man hesitated before handing him a tablet. Mr. Smith's eyes scanned the screen, his expression darkening with every second. Finally, he set it down, his jaw tightening. "What is it?" Mia asked, unable to contain her curiosity. Mr. Smith glanced at her, and for a moment, she saw something unguarded in his eyes, fear, maybe even regret. "It seems," he said slowly, "that whoever leaked the files decided to turn the spotlight on me as well. And they've uncovered some inconvenient truths." The room erupted in whispers as the board members leaned in to read the tablet's screen. Mia felt her stomach drop as she caught snippets of the headlines: "Corporate fixer tied to shady deals and mysterious consultant linked to hospital bankruptcies." Foster's eyes gleamed with newfound confidence. "So, the great Mr. Smith isn't so untouchable after all," he sneered. Mr. Smith remained composed, though his grip on the table tightened. "This changes nothing," he said firmly. "The facts about this hospital remain the same, and they require immediate action." But the board members weren't listening. Their focus had shifted entirely, their concern for the hospital now overshadowed by the revelations about the man who claimed to be its savior. Mia felt a strange mix of emotions, relief that Foster wasn't entirely in the clear, but also unease at how quickly the tables had turned. Mr. Smith had seemed invincible, yet now he was vulnerable, just like the rest of them. As the board argued amongst themselves, Foster seized the opportunity to regain control. "You see?" he said, addressing the room. "This man came here pretending to clean up our mess, but he's been playing us all along. We can't trust him." Mia looked at Mr. Smith, whose gaze remained fixed on Foster. There was something in his eyes, a quiet resolve, as though he'd anticipated this moment all along. Finally, he spoke, his voice cutting through the chaos. "Believe what you want about me," he said. "But ask yourselves this: if I hadn't come here, would any of you have known the truth about Foster? About the hospital's finances? About the lives at stake?" The room fell silent again. Mr. Smith turned to Mia, his expression softening. "And you, Nurse Bennett? You wanted the truth. Now you have it. The question is, what will you do with it?" Mia felt the weight of his words, the weight of the choice before her. She looked at Foster, at the board, at the chaos unraveling around her. And for the first time, she realized that the real power wasn't in exposing the truth, it was in deciding what came next. Before she could respond, the suited man stepped forward again, his voice urgent. "Sir, we have to go." "There's more coming." Mr. Smith nodded, his calm returning. He turned to Mia one last time. "The storm is far from over," he said. "But I trust you'll weather it well." And with that, he was gone, leaving Mia to face the aftermath of everything he'd set in motion. As the boardroom erupted into chaos once more, she stood silently, the weight of her next move pressing down on her like a heavy storm cloud. Mia stood motionless as the room erupted into a whirlwind of voices. Board members shouted over one another, their anger and fear palpable. Foster, now more emboldened by the revelations about Mr. Smith, was pacing at the front of the room, trying to maintain control over the situation. He was no longer the cornered man. Now, he was the one calling the shots, his every word dripping with confidence. But Mia couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this, something far darker lurking beneath the surface of everything happening in the room. She glanced around, watching the board members scramble, their faces etched with confusion and mistrust. No one seemed to know what to believe anymore, and the hospital's fate was hanging by a thread. She thought about what Mr. Smith had said earlier, the truth always comes out, one way or another. Was that really the truth, though? The more Mia dug, the more she wondered if the truth was even enough to save them. Foster stopped pacing and turned to the board, his voice loud and commanding. "This hospital is a sinking ship. We've been underfunded, mismanaged, and manipulated for years. This man, this consultant, he came here with one purpose, to bring us to our knees. And now we see the truth." Mia's hands tightened into fists at her sides. She wanted to stand up, to shout that it wasn't just Foster's fault. That it wasn't all one person's doing. But there was something in the way Foster spoke now that made it hard to find her voice. He was playing them all, and they were buying into it. A voice broke through the tension. "But what about the people who have already been hurt?" one of the board members asked, her face pale. "The surgeries, the financial mismanagement. All of it has cost lives." Foster didn't flinch. "Of course it has," he said coldly. "But those lives, those mistakes, are just collateral damage in the bigger picture. We can't save everyone. Not anymore." Mia's chest tightened. The cruelty in his words hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about the hospital or the finances, it was about control. And Foster, with all his faults and all his guilt, was fighting to hold on to that control at any cost. She turned to Mr. Smith, who had remained eerily quiet through it all. He had been waiting for this moment. Now, as the board was clearly leaning toward Foster's narrative, he stepped forward, his expression calm and unreadable. "We've reached a crossroads, ladies and gentlemen," Mr. Smith said, his voice cutting through the chaos. "You've seen the evidence, and you've heard the arguments. But the question is, what will you do next? Will you give in to fear, or will you choose a different path?" Mia's eyes narrowed as she watched the room shift. She was starting to see something different in Mr. Smith's eyes, something calculating. He wasn't simply trying to fix the hospital. He was maneuvering pieces on a chessboard, positioning himself to win no matter which way the game went. Suddenly, everything seemed to slow down. The voices blurred, and Mia found herself standing apart from the crowd. It was as if she could see the whole situation laid out before her, the chaos, the lies, the manipulation. Mr. Smith had come to uncover the truth, but was he part of the problem too? Her gaze flicked to the door as she heard footsteps approaching. She wasn't alone anymore. Another figure entered the room, someone who hadn't been there before. The sight of her sent a chill through Mia's spine. Lisa, the nurse from the break room, walked in with a folder in her hands. She locked eyes with Mia, and for a brief moment, the tension in the room seemed to shift. "Lisa?" Mia asked, barely able to mask her surprise. Lisa didn't say a word at first. She simply walked toward the table, where she placed the folder down in front of Mr. Smith. "I think you should see this," she said quietly. Mia's breath caught in her throat as Mr. Smith took the folder from Lisa's hands. His eyes flicked to her, then back to the contents of the folder. His face remained impassive, but there was a flicker of recognition in his gaze. "What's in there?" Mia asked, her voice trembling slightly. Without responding, Mr. Smith began to scan the pages. His brows furrowed as he turned each page with precision. A silence fell over the room. The board members had stopped arguing, and even Foster seemed to realize that something was happening, something he hadn't accounted for. Finally, Mr. Smith looked up, his face ashen. "Where did you find this?" he asked Lisa, his voice tight. "I found it," she said simply, "where you told me to." Mia's head spun. "What are you talking about?" Lisa met her gaze, her expression unreadable. "You asked me to dig deeper. I didn't know everything at first, but I knew something was wrong." She looked at Mr. Smith. I didn't know you were behind it all. Not until I saw your name." The room seemed to close in around Mia. Lisa's words were like a bombshell, and she felt the ground shift beneath her feet. Everything had been a game to Mr. Smith. He hadn't come to save the hospital, he had come to destroy it and rebuild it in his own image. Foster's eyes widened, and for the first time, he seemed genuinely rattled. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded. Mr. Smith didn't respond right away. He closed his eyes for a moment, as if gathering his thoughts. Then he stood taller, his demeanor returning to that cold, calculating persona. "The game has changed," he said simply. "And now, it's over." In a blur, the pieces started to fall into place. The leaks, the manipulation, the secrets that had been buried for years. It wasn't just about saving the hospital, it was about taking control of it, about creating a new empire. And now, Mia realized, Mr. Smith had played everyone. Even her. Lisa stepped back, her face grim. "It's all in motion. There's no turning back now." Mia stood frozen, the weight of everything crashing down on her all at once. She had thought she could control the situation, thought she could stand up for what was right. But now, she understood the true cost of the truth. It wasn't just about the hospital's fate, it was about power. And in the end, it seemed, no one could escape the consequences of the game they'd all been playing. As Mr. Smith's gaze met hers one last time, Mia felt the full force of the realization, the storm had only just begun. And she was standing at the eye of it. Mia's thoughts raced, her mind struggling to grasp the magnitude of what was unfolding before her. The room had fallen eerily quiet after Mr. Smith's revelation, the weight of his words hanging heavily in the air. The board members, once shouting and accusing each other, now stood still, waiting for the next move in this twisted game. Foster's face was pale, the bravado he had earlier now gone, replaced by a look of disbelief. Lisa, too, seemed to withdraw into herself, her earlier confidence fading as she crossed her arms and glanced nervously at Mia. There was no comfort in the silence that followed, only a sense of impending doom. The hospital, everything they had fought for, was now at the mercy of forces beyond their control. Mia took a deep breath, steeling herself. She couldn't afford to be weak, not now. The truth was out, and there was no going back. She glanced at Mr. Smith, who stood at the center of it all, his expression unreadable as he absorbed the shock of the moment. She couldn't shake the nagging feeling that everything had been manipulated from the start, that this was never about saving the hospital. It had always been about something far more sinister: power, control, and the destruction of anyone who stood in the way. "Mr. Smith," Mia began, her voice shaky but determined. "What do you want now? What happens next?" He turned to her, his eyes sharp and calculating, as if sizing her up for the first time. "Now, we rebuild. We start fresh," he said coldly. "But not for the reasons you think. This place. It's a relic. What we have here is nothing but a foundation for something bigger. Something more profitable." Mia's stomach churned. She felt like she was standing on the edge of a cliff, looking down into a bottomless abyss. "You're going to destroy it, aren't you?" Mr. Smith didn't answer right away. He allowed the silence to stretch, before finally speaking again, his voice laced with an unsettling calm. "Sometimes, destruction is the only way to build something stronger." Mia's hands trembled as she clenched them into fists. She couldn't let this happen, not after everything. Not after the countless hours she had spent trying to protect the hospital and its people. This was her home, and she wouldn't stand by and watch it fall into the hands of someone like Mr. Smith. "Not if I can stop you," she muttered under her breath, more to herself than anyone else. Mr. Smith's eyes flicked to her, and a small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. "You can try, Mia. But it's too late. The wheels are already in motion. The board is with me now." The room shifted again as the board members, who had been silent up until now, began to murmur amongst themselves. The shift was palpable. What had once been a group of desperate individuals now seemed to have united under the banner of Mr. Smith's vision. They were playing his game now, and Mia realized with a sinking feeling that she was alone. But then something unexpected happened. Lisa, the quiet nurse who had seemed so timid earlier, stepped forward, her face set with determination. "He's lying," she said, her voice unwavering. The room fell silent again. All eyes turned to Lisa as she faced Mr. Smith. "You think you have control, but you don't," she continued. "You've manipulated us all, twisted the truth, but you've forgotten one thing." "And what's that?" Mr. Smith asked, his voice dangerously low. Lisa held up the folder that had caused the shockwave earlier. "This isn't the whole truth. You think you're the only one who knows how to play the game, but I've been watching you. I know your moves before you make them." Mia felt a surge of hope. Lisa wasn't going down without a fight. Maybe, just maybe, there was a way to turn the tide. Mr. Smith's demeanor shifted slightly, but his cool exterior remained. "You're wasting your time," he said, though there was a hint of uncertainty now in his voice. But Lisa wasn't done. "It's not just about control. It's about what happens when people stop believing in the system. When they stop trusting the ones in charge." She turned to Mia, her eyes softening. "This is your hospital, Mia. You're not alone in this." Mia's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't realized it until now, but Lisa was right. This place wasn't just about the board, or Mr. Smith, or even the money. It was about the people who had built it, the ones who had fought through the years of hardships to keep it alive. "You're right," Mia said, her voice gaining strength. "This is our hospital. Not his." The tension in the room crackled as the board members began to exchange uncertain glances. The tide was turning, but Mia knew they weren't out of danger yet. Mr. Smith had too much power, and there were still too many unknowns. But with Lisa's support, things had changed. They weren't fighting this battle alone anymore. With a deep breath, Mia turned to the group. "This ends now. We take control back, together. We start by getting the truth out. Every secret, every manipulation, it all comes to light." The board members were starting to waver now. They were beginning to see the cracks in Mr. Smith's facade, the cracks that Mia had been trying to point out all along. The truth was powerful. And no amount of manipulation could erase that. Mr. Smith, sensing the shift, took a step back. He had always been a master of control, but now he seemed unsure for the first time in this entire ordeal. "You don't understand," he spat, his voice trembling with anger. "You think you can stop this, but you can't. It's bigger than you. It's bigger than all of us." "I don't need to understand," Mia said, her voice firm. "I just need to fight for what's right. And I'll do whatever it takes to make sure this hospital stays in the hands of the people who care about it." For the first time since the confrontation began, the board members nodded in agreement. The shift was complete. The tide had turned. Mr. Smith's face twisted in fury as he realized the control he once had was slipping away. But it was too late. The people had spoken, and the truth had won. As the dust settled and the board members began to take action to restore order, Mia looked around at the faces of those who had stood by her: Lisa, the nurses, the staff, all of them united in their desire to protect what they had built. It was over. The hospital was theirs again. But Mia knew this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter. A chapter where power wasn't about manipulation or control, but about trust and integrity. And Mia was ready to lead them into that future. As the room began to quiet down and the sounds of movement resumed, Mia looked out the window, a sense of peace settling over her. The storm had passed, but the lessons learned would stay with her forever. And with that, the story of their victory was only beginning. As the dust continued to settle, the air was still thick with the aftermath of the confrontation. The hospital that had once teetered on the brink of destruction was now on the path to recovery. The board members, though hesitant at first, had come to terms with the fact that they could no longer turn a blind eye to the corruption that had infiltrated their ranks. Mia and Lisa had stood up to Mr. Smith, and together, they had exposed his lies. But the road ahead was not going to be easy. The next few days were a whirlwind. Meetings were held, policies were rewritten, and old alliances were shattered. Mia was at the center of it all, leading the charge with unwavering determination. She knew that the battle was far from over. The hospital was in disarray, but the foundation had been laid for something better, something more transparent, and something that would ensure the future of the institution was in the hands of those who truly cared for it. Lisa had proven herself to be a valuable ally in this fight. Her quiet strength and sharp mind had been crucial in uncovering the final pieces of Mr. Smith's plan. Mia couldn't help but admire her resilience. Together, they had worked to gather evidence, speak with employees, and rebuild the trust that had been so severely damaged. It hadn't been easy, and there were moments when Mia had doubted whether they could pull it off, but they had. And now, the weight of the hospital's future rested on their shoulders. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the hospital building cast long shadows, Mia sat in her office, looking over the papers that would soon be presented to the board for approval. She was exhausted, but a sense of pride washed over her. The long hours, the sleepless nights, the constant battle to keep the hospital afloat, it had all led to this moment. They were going to make it. Lisa knocked softly and entered the office, her face tired but determined. "Mia, I think we've done it," she said, her voice steady. Mia looked up, her eyes meeting Lisa's with a mixture of relief and anticipation. "I think we have, too," she replied, a smile tugging at her lips. "But this is just the beginning. We need to make sure this never happens again." Lisa nodded. "Agreed. But we're on the right track now. People are starting to believe in what we're doing. We've got their trust again." Mia leaned back in her chair, letting out a deep breath. "I never thought we'd get here. It's like we're finally moving forward, instead of just trying to survive." She paused, a thoughtful look crossing her face. "It feels like we've won, but I can't shake the feeling that we're not done yet." Lisa raised an eyebrow. "You think there's more to this?" Mia hesitated, her gaze shifting to the papers in front of her. "I don't know. Something about Mr. Smith's departure doesn't sit right with me. He was so sure of himself, so certain that he had control. But he didn't fight back like I expected. It was almost too easy." Lisa frowned, her brow furrowing. "You think he had help?" Mia's eyes narrowed, a growing suspicion taking root. "Maybe. Or maybe he was just a pawn in a much bigger game." She pushed the papers aside, standing up. "I need to find out more. I can't let this go, not now." Lisa stepped forward, her expression serious. "You've already done more than anyone thought possible, Mia. But if you think there's more to uncover, then I'll be right there with you." Mia nodded, her resolve hardening. "We'll get to the bottom of this. No matter what it takes." The next few days were filled with more investigation, as Mia and Lisa dug deeper into Mr. Smith's connections. They spoke to more of the hospital staff, reviewed more files, and followed every lead that presented itself. Slowly, a pattern began to emerge, one that suggested Mr. Smith had been part of something far larger than Mia had initially realized. His departure was not the end, but a strategic move in a larger game of corporate manipulation and power struggles that stretched far beyond the walls of the hospital. But despite all their efforts, they could never quite piece together the full picture. The higher-ups, the ones who might have been pulling the strings behind the scenes, remained elusive. Every time they thought they were getting closer to the truth, they were met with dead ends, or worse, threats that made them question who they could trust. The fight for the hospital wasn't over, it was just beginning. One night, Mia sat alone in her office, reviewing the files one last time before heading home. The quiet hum of the fluorescent lights above her was the only sound in the room. She paused, a sense of unease creeping over her as she scanned through a set of documents that had slipped through the cracks earlier. As she read, her eyes widened, her breath catching in her throat. There, hidden in the fine print, was a name she hadn't seen before, one that sent a shiver down her spine. The name was connected to several board members, and it appeared to be linked to a shell corporation, a company that had been buying up land and facilities under the radar. The same land where the hospital stood. Her heart raced as she connected the dots. The hospital had been the target all along. The destruction wasn't just about a few corrupt individuals, it was about something much larger, the takeover of an entire medical empire. Mia realized with chilling clarity that they had been playing checkers while the people behind the scenes were playing chess. Mia leaned back in her chair, her mind reeling. She had come so far, but this new revelation changed everything. The battle for the hospital was far from over, and the true enemy was still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The game had changed again, and Mia knew one thing for certain, the next move was hers. But this time, she would have to be more careful, more calculated. The stakes had never been higher. With the new information in hand, Mia knew she had to act quickly, but she couldn't do it alone. Lisa would be the key to unraveling this new web of deceit. Together, they would need to outsmart those who thought they had already won. The hospital, its future, and the lives of countless others depended on it.